Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. It's a story that we talked about actually a ton on this show about a year ago. It involves my alma mater, the University of Connecticut, and those pesky rumors about a potential leaving the Big East for the Big 12. And so the report break, first of all, credit where it's due. I wish I had figured out who it was, but it was about probably 10 days ago. One of these Big 12 podcasts, it might have been Locked On the Big 12 or one of these podcasts, like they put out a report that they put out a podcast where they said UConn, Big 12, that's starting to ramp up again. And I had a bunch of UConn fans send it to me. You know, I did my due diligence, whatever. We didn't talk about it on the show. But I bring it up because Friday afternoon, The Athletic put out a report that UConn and the Big 12 are back in discussions again after those two sides spoke quite a bit, really the spring of 2023 through the summer of 2023. Now, we're going to get into why that fell apart in a minute because I think that's important. But I think the important new twists from the last couple months with UConn and the Big 12 are this, is that UConn, again, whoever reached out, UConn was actually in the Big 12 offices last week. They presented a proposal where all the sports that the Big 12 sponsors would come except for football, and that football would wait until 2031 to be a full member of the Big 12. Now, why is that important? It is because 2031 is actually when the current Big 12 media rights deal expires. And so that's important because what UConn's basically saying is whatever money you guys got for football, we do not want to mess with it. And also what kind of held up UConn a year ago was that a lot of the Big 12 school presidents really weren't sold on UConn as an athletic department because of the football program. So what UConn's basically saying is, hey, give us 6 years, 5 years to get our stuff in order, and we will bring a program that's ready to compete in the Big 12. Now, I'll say this, maybe it's my UConn bias, but I think in the NIL era, if UConn had Power 4 conference football money, I think UConn could be competitive in like 3 years. That might sound crazy. It might sound insane, but look at Kansas. Kansas has the right coach. Overnight, you got a little NIL, you can retain your players, you hit on a couple guys, and all of a sudden Kansas is actually a very viable team in the Big 12. They could win the Big 12 this year. Arizona's good. So, I mean, UConn doesn't need a ton. What they can't have is what they have right now, which is like $12 million in TV money in a world where everybody's going to pay 20 plus million to their athletes starting next year. And so that's what has happened. Apparently now Brett Yormark, the Big 12 commissioner, is going to now present to his school presidents this week. And so I want to get into it. I want to discuss, but really to understand why, listen, I believe this is a thing. I don't believe it's nothing. I think we're probably talking about UConn has crossed the 50-yard line, but I don't believe they're in the red zone. I don't believe they're on the goal line. I don't believe this is getting done in the next week or the next 3 weeks or the next this or the next that. And to fully understand why, let me go ahead and explain, because ultimately I do think that you need the context of last year to understand why somebody like me kind of is a little dubious about how quickly this is going to come together. So if you go back to last year, what I can tell you is I really started to hear some Big 12 UConn rumors right around the Final Four of 2023, okay? Now, that's an important date. Remember, that was the year UConn played San Diego State in the national championship game. FAU was there. Miami was there. But I'm at the Final Four. You start hearing whispers. And what's important to remember about that time frame, this was before the Pac-12 broke up. This was before SMU and Cal and Stanford were part of the ACC. At this moment in time, all that had happened in realignment, Texas and Oklahoma had officially left for the Big 12, or from the Big 12 to the SEC. UCLA and USC had officially left for the Big 10, but the other 10 schools in the Pac-10 were still intact. Pac-12 were still intact. And so that's an important thing because that's where we were at that moment in realignment. And what I can tell you, the belief in circles that mattered was this, was that the Pac-12 was trying to figure out their TV contract. And my understanding was the Pac-12 or the Big 12 kind of knew Colorado wants out. Colorado's been waiting for a TV contract. The Pac-12 can't come up with anything. Colorado's ready to leave. They're gonna go to Pac-12 Media Day, say all the right things, but they're ready to bounce. They're ready to get out. They're ready to do something different. They want the guaranteed money of the Big 12. And so Colorado was in. Then from there, my understanding was that UConn was next in line. This is in the spring of 2023. And the reason being really twofold. One, Brett Yormark, remember, Big 12 commissioner. Where did he come from? He's a Northeast guy, worked at Rock Nation, which is, of course, the agency based out of New York City. And Brett Yormark really wanted UConn for a few reasons. One, he wanted the Northeast brand, the Northeast corridor, kind of, UConn, they're as relevant as anybody in the Northeast. Maybe Penn State's a little bit more because of football, whatever. But UConn is available. That's who we want. Two, UConn falls in line with what Brett Yormark wanted from his expansion candidates. He wanted Colorado for the football reasons. But two, what Brett Yormark's goals are, and I think I was probably the first one in the national media on this. One, he knows that he can't build a better football conference than the SEC and the Big 12. Those schools do not exist. There are no schools that the Big 12 can realistically get that make them better or on par with the SEC and the Big 10. Even if they got Clemson and Florida State, they're still not there. And so what Brett Yormark's goal is, put together the best football conference that you can. And from there, what I want to do is build the best basketball conference that has ever existed. And the thought process on this, we talked about this a ton in the spring of 23. I had a bunch of people retweeting things that I said on the show at that time. The thought process there is pretty straightforward. It's if we build the best basketball conference that has ever existed, if one day in the future, the SEC and the Big 10 try to break off and do their own thing, well, listen, they're going to have all the clout in football. I can't change that. But they're going to have to include us because even if football controls like 99% of the narrative, and that's hyperbole, but 80% of the narrative in college football, in college sports, people still love the college basketball tournament. And so if you're going to put on a college basketball tournament, you got to put it on with the Big 12, which had Kansas at the time, which had Houston at the time. And obviously the goal was get UConn. Also, by the way, believe that Arizona was in the mix at that time without Arizona State, which we'll discuss in a minute, Gonzaga as well. So those were Brett Yormark's thoughts. I believe like late April of last year, I think that's what he thought was going to happen. From there, two big things happened that really screwed things up from the UConn perspective, from Yormark's perspective, is first off, he couldn't get the school presidents on board. And the school presidents, again, I think there was concerns about football. How competitive will they be? Do we want to bring them in? They're great at basketball, but what about football? But two, so he couldn't get the school presidents on board. But the big thing that happened, Pac-12 fell apart. And I know I'm going deep into this, but you need the context to understand why we are back to where we are today. And so when the whole conversation started, the Big 12 had a pretty good feel Colorado's out. They're not coming back. But I bring it up to very simply say that I think the Pac-12 thought everybody was going to stay. And then what happened? And by the way, they were going to stay because people didn't have better options. It's easy to forget at the time. But obviously, Oregon State, Washington State, Cal, Stanford had no better option. Oregon and Washington really didn't have the Big 10 option at the time. And so they were kind of stuck. Arizona State wanted to stay in the Pac-12. That is indisputable. Go back, my buddy Mike Luke, my buddy Jason Shearer talked about it for days on end. ASU school president doesn't care about sports. He didn't want to be bothered switching a league. Utah wanted to stay in the Pac-12 because they were like, we're dominating this league. Let's keep this thing together because we're kicking everybody's butt. So at the time, you think it's going to stay together. And then, boom, like that overnight, it falls apart. Arizona wants out. Now, all of a sudden, Arizona State's like, well, if Arizona's leaving, I better get my butt on board as well. But really what it stemmed from was that awful TV contract that was terrible. I forget all the details, but it was like an Apple TV deal. Like you get $20 million a year and if it, whatever. But everybody was like, that is unacceptable. So all of a sudden now Utah and Arizona State are willing to leave. Oregon and Washington are willing to take less than a full share to go to the to go from the Pac-12 to the Big 10. And then boom, the league falls apart. League falls apart. Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, Utah go to the Big 12. And at that point, the Big 12 is like, we're not expanding. So that is how the very long-winded story of UConn did not end up in the Big 12 a year ago. Well, fast forward, and what I think is interesting is a couple things. One, UConn very clearly understands the football thing is a crutch. How do we work around this? Well, we wait till 2031. We wait till the TV contract is over. We'll figure out a way to make it work. But two, what also stands out is positives and negatives on both sides. I don't believe on a positive side that Brett Yormark ever stopped wanting UConn. He understands the value of the UConn brand in the Northeast. He understands, by the way, this is a guy multiple people have reported. The next TV contract, he's going to try to sell the basketball rights separate from the football rights. So UConn is a very valuable asset. I'll be blunt. I know this for a fact. That big TV deal that the Big East just signed, they just signed a new TV deal. UConn is a big part of why they got the number that they got. It's still not SEC Big 10 money. It's not even ACC Big 12 money, but the money would have been much less without UConn. So I bring it up. That's the positive. The negative, and this is why I didn't rush to YouTube to do an immediate reaction on Friday. I still don't know if Brett Yormark is going to get sign off from the Big 12 league presidents. Got to get 12 out of 16 to agree to add UConn. Then from there, you got to figure out who else are you going to add with them. 17 is kind of a weird number. And so I know I've been talking about this topic for probably like 13 minutes now or whatever. I don't know that we're near a finish line. I think because it leaked, I don't think it's 0%, but I think the same issues that UConn ran into a year ago, they're going to continue to run into. Can you convince that Texas Tech school president to get on board, that Baylor school president, that West Virginia school president to get on board? And then most importantly, you got to explain to them, one, how it's not going to mess with your money. In other words, are these schools going to get less money? Brett Yormark has promised that they won't. But then two, as importantly, how does this make more money? And I think Brett Yormark is going to do the 30,000 foot, if we get these schools, think about what the next TV contract could look like. But at the same time, we're not there yet. And so it's hard for me to get excited. It's hard for me to believe that we're at the finish line. Could be dead wrong. Don't think I am, though. Couple quick notes before we get out of here, because I get asked this all the time from the UConn perspective. Why would UConn want to leave the Big East? By the way, this is a misinformed fact. Why would UConn want to leave the Big East again? First off, UConn never left the Big East. UConn got kicked out of the Big East in whatever it was, 2012, 2013. The Big East was an all basketball conference. Nobody had FBS football. And I bring it up because UConn was playing FBS football. So there was no league for them to play in, and they got kicked out. They come back, but why would they leave the Big East again? The reason is let me even backtrack. People think, oh, they're going to leave because they want to keep building up football. No. It's actually because they want to protect all the other sports. As I said, you go forward to next year, schools are going to be able to pay $20 million a year to their players. I don't know how it's all going to get dispersed, whatever. But guess what? You know who's going to be screwed? Everybody that's not in one of those Power 4 conferences. Because here's the bottom line. I think the new TV deal for the Big East, which doesn't even kick in for another year, I think it's for like $15 million a year, okay? So I'm not great at math. But if everybody else is paying $20 million to their athletes, you only got $15 million in TV money. And remember, the Big 10 schools, the SEC schools are going to be getting $60 or $70 million. Not great at math, but when you got to pay out 20 to keep up with everybody, and you only got 12, 13, 14, 15, whatever it is, not great at math. Math doesn't really add up. So that is why UConn wants to align themselves with the Big 12 or a power football conference. It's not really about football. It's to make sure that basketball can continue to operate at the highest level. We talked about this when Dan Hurley interviewed for the Lakers. Well, guess what? If Dan Hurley leaves in 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, like you want to be in position where you can continue to maintain at the highest level, and you don't have to hope that you somehow pull a rabbit out of your hat and hire someone as good as Dan Hurley, because I don't think that person exists. So that's the logic behind it. By the way, last thought, because I know I'm going really long here, because I know a lot of people have asked me. My understanding is the two biggest advocates on campus for this move, besides Jim Mora, obviously the football coach, are Dan Hurley and Gino Auriemma. They understand the future of college sports. You got to be tied to a Power 4 football conference. You have to have that revenue coming in, or it's going to be really hard to survive. Gino Auriemma, I was told, like, last year when this was going on, he was the biggest advocate on campus. He understood. He's given his life to the University of Connecticut, and he wants to see this thing maintain well beyond when he's gone. And so I don't know where we're at, but that's how I think we ended up here.